The air in Blackwood Manor is thick with dust, decay, and something else. Something that presses on the back of your neck, whispering just out of hearing. I am Dr. Eleanor Vance. For 10 years I studied fractured minds behind reinforced glass and steel in maximum security facilities. My clients wore orange jumpsuits and confessed horrors I could barely imagine. I thought I had seen humanity's darkest corners. I was wrong. This is about Blackwood Manor and the disappearances that have plagued the Blackwood family for generations. This is about a crime that has no earthly explanation, about a place that breathes evil. They sent me here because of my psychological background, because I understand fractured minds, and because my great-aunt Clara Vance vanished near here 50 years ago. They thought I could bring fresh perspective. They didn't know I would become part of the story. This isn't a simple case study or police procedural. This is a confession that starts as quiet mystery and ends in screaming darkness. This is the truth of Blackwood Manor, the truth I dug up, the truth that is now buried inside me. If you're watching this, thank you. Stay with me. Listen closely. This story might change how you see the world. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. Let me know what time you're watching this and where you're listening from right now. The answer might surprise you. The road to Blackwood Manor ended 2 miles back. From there, it was just mud and tangled growth. My government-issued sedan was useless, so I used a sturdy rental SUV. It felt small and fragile now as the forest pressed in close. Douglas firs stood like silent dark guards, blocking out the sun. The air grew colder here, even though it was summer. I had driven for hours through winding mountain roads, leaving civilization behind mile by mile. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, leaving me with only handwritten directions from the local sheriff's office. The forest on either side of the narrow road seemed ancient, untouched by human hands for centuries. Massive trees towered overhead, their canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight. Blackwood Manor appeared slowly through the trees, like a fever dream materializing from mist. It wasn't grand in the way you see in movies, no sweeping lawns or manicured gardens. Instead, it was gaunt and gray, a testament to decades of neglect. Paint peeled like sunburned skin from its weathered siding. Windows were dark, empty eyes that seemed to follow my approach. The house sagged in the middle, as if its back was broken under the weight of its own dark history. A stone wall, crumbling in places, surrounded the property. It did nothing to keep the forest out. Twisted roots and creeping vines had long since breached its defenses. More unsettling was the thought that it might be failing to keep whatever was inside from leaving. I parked the SUV by the rusted iron gate that hung open on one hinge like a broken jaw. A wooden sign was nailed crookedly to a moss-covered post. The letters were faded, almost gone, but I could still read them. Private property, keep out. It was a warning no one here had ever truly heeded. Not really. My contact was supposed to meet me here. Deputy Miller from the local law enforcement. He wasn't there. Just the silence and the forest pressing in from all sides. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, but underneath lurked something else. A faint, sweet smell like rotting flowers mixed with something metallic. It was deeply unsettling. I stepped through the gate, and the gravel drive crunched too loudly under my boots. Each step sounded like gunshots in the oppressive quiet. The house loomed closer now, larger and more desolate with every yard. A sense of dread began to settle over me. Not the clinical unease I felt in prison interviews, but something primal and ancient. It felt like being watched by something very old and infinitely patient. The front steps were stone, worn smooth by time and weather. Moss grew in the cracks between them, and small puddles of stagnant water reflected the gray sky overhead. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness deeper than the shadows outside. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to get in my car and drive away from this place. But I thought of Clara, my great-aunt, who had vanished without a trace 50 years ago. I thought of the families who deserved answers, who had been living with questions for decades. I pushed the door open wider. It groaned in protest, a sound that echoed through the stillness like a wounded animal. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that fell from the doorway across the warped hardwood floor. The house felt cold, colder than the air outside, as if something was actively draining warmth from the atmosphere. A smell of mildew and old decay filled my nose, along with that strange sweet smell again, stronger now and more cloying. Inside the foyer, a grand staircase curved upward into shadow. The wood had been dark and polished once, but now it was dull and scarred. Cobwebs hung like macabre decorations from the banister and ceiling. On a small table by the stairs, I saw something that didn't belong, not covered in dust like everything else. A smooth grey stone, perfectly round, about the size of a golf ball, and on top of it, a single drop of crimson that was still wet. Fresh, recent, someone had been here. And recently, this wasn't in my briefing. My instructions had been simple. Assess the property for potential environmental hazards, review the recent disappearance reports, and speak to anyone still living in the area. The sight of that fresh stain changed everything. It turned a routine cold case review into something immediate and dangerous. I took out my small digital camera and photographed the stone from multiple angles, noting the details in my notebook. The stain was small, perhaps from a pricked finger. But why here? Why on this particular stone? I made a mental note to have it tested if I could figure out how to get a sample back to civilization. I began to explore the ground floor systematically, room by room. Dust sheets covered most of the furniture, like shrouds, ghosts of a past life, frozen in time. In the living room, a grand piano sat silent in the corner. The keys were yellowed with age, and a thick layer of dust coated everything. Sheet music still sat on the stand, Chopin's Funeral March, appropriately enough. The dining room contained a long table with chairs tucked in neatly, as if ready for guests who would never arrive. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, many of its pieces missing or cracked. Portraits on the walls showed stone-faced people in period clothing, their eyes seeming to follow me as I moved through the room. The frames were ornate but tarnished, and several paintings showed signs of water damage. The kitchen was a snapshot of another era. Cast iron stove, old wooden cabinets, copper pots and pans still hanging on hooks. It looked like the occupants had simply walked away one day, leaving everything behind. A calendar on the wall was turned to October 1998, the pages yellowed and brittle. In what appeared to be a study or library, I found a large desk covered in papers. Unlike everything else in the house, these weren't covered in dust. They were newer, more recent. File folders, stapled reports, official documents with government letterheads. I opened the first one and felt my blood run cold. Missing Persons Report. File number 1807B. Name: Thomas Blackwood. Date of disappearance: 2 weeks ago. Age: 62. Description: last known resident of Blackwood Manor. Last seen by neighbor Silas Croft entering the manor grounds at approximately 4 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. No signs of forced entry found, no evidence of struggle, no indication of where he might have gone, just gone. There were other reports in the file, older ones filed under similar case numbers. My hands trembled as I read through them. Missing Persons Report. File number 9803. Name: Sarah Blackwood. Date of disappearance: 17 years ago. Age: 25. Last seen leaving the manor for an evening walk along the property's perimeter. She never returned. Search parties combed the area for weeks. No trace was ever found. No clothing, no personal effects, nothing. The case went cold after 6 months. Missing Persons Report. File number 6511D. Name: Robert Blackwood. Date of disappearance: 50 years ago. Age: 34. Last seen by a delivery driver on the manor grounds, checking on some repairs to the stone wall. His car was still in the driveway the next morning, keys on the kitchen table, but Robert was nowhere to be found. The reports were frustratingly similar. No witnesses to the actual disappearances, no apparent motive for leaving, no evidence of foul play, but also no evidence that they had left voluntarily, just vanishings, as if these people had simply evaporated into thin air. The local police notes were filled with speculation. Maybe they ran away, maybe there was foul play, maybe an animal attack, but no evidence for any of it, just dead ends, page after page of dead ends. And then I noticed the chilling pattern. Always a Blackwood, always on the property, always gone without a trace. I found a handwritten note attached to Thomas Blackwood's report. It was from a detective whose name had been blacked out with permanent marker. The note read, "This mirrors the previous incidents too closely to be coincidence. There's something fundamentally wrong here, something beyond typical criminal activity. The lack of physical evidence in all cases suggests either an exceptionally sophisticated perpetrator or," the note trailed off there, as if the detective had thought better of completing that sentence. Looking out the dusty window at the forest beyond, I felt the hair on my arms stand up. The trees seemed to be watching, waiting, the fresh stain on the stone, the reports, they were all connected. This wasn't a random disappearance. It was another instance of whatever had been happening here for decades. The manor had a small library adjacent to the study, and it was in better condition than the other rooms. Books lined the shelves from floor to ceiling, old leather bindings that filled the air with a musty smell mixed with that persistent sweet odor. I found a section dedicated to local history, and another filled with what appeared to be family papers, ledgers, and personal journals. I started with the oldest documents I could find: birth records, marriage certificates, death notices. The Blackwood family line stretched back centuries in this area. They had been among the first settlers, owning vast tracts of land, including the entire forest that surrounded the manor. Then I found them, leather-bound journals secured with small brass clasps, some so old the leather was brittle to the touch. I carefully opened the oldest one, dated 1785. The handwriting was spidery and difficult to read, but the entries told a story that made my skin crawl. October 14th, 1785. The woods surrounding our new home are not as still as they appear during daylight hours. Strange sounds echo through the trees at night, not the calls of beasts or the whisper of wind through branches, but something else entirely, like weeping or perhaps the sound of claws scraping against bark. November 3rd, 1785. Elias Whitmore, our most capable woodsman, has vanished. He took his best axe into the western section of forest 3 days past and has not returned. We organized search parties and combed every inch of ground we could manage. All we found was his hat, caught on a low branch, and beneath it a patch of ground that was unnaturally cold to the touch. No footprints leading in or out, no sign of struggle, no trace of blood or torn clothing. December 1st, 1785. The native peoples who traded with us before we began clearing the land have returned with warnings. They speak of this place in hushed, fearful tones. They say the land is old, older than their oldest stories, and that it harbors spirits that are not merely restless, but actively malevolent. These spirits, they claim, demand payment for any who would dwell here. Elias, they suggest, was merely the first installment on a debt that will never be fully satisfied. More entries followed, documenting additional disappearances and increasingly strange events. Livestock would vanish overnight, leaving no trace except for patches of that same unnaturally cold ground. People would become withdrawn and distant, then walk into the woods one day and never return. Most disturbing were the descriptions of symbols found carved into tree trunks, symbols that matched markings I had noticed scratched into the window frames upstairs. I found a journal from 1898, written by someone named Silas Blackwood. His entries were more panicked, more desperate than the earlier ones. He wrote about the hunger and the whispers, and mentioned attempts to appease whatever was in the forest through rituals and offerings. July 22nd, 1898. It has taken poor Agnes Whitmore, Elias's granddaughter. She was walking by the creek that runs through the property when she simply disappeared. I heard the sound myself from the house, like fabric being torn, but amplified somehow, echoing through the trees. When I reached the spot where she had been walking, there was nothing, no sign of struggle, no disturbed earth, no torn clothing. It grows bolder with each passing season. The hunger must be fed, but I know not how. August 5th, 1898. I have been researching what the local indigenous peoples call the old ways. They speak of a binding ritual, a way to establish balance between our world and whatever dwells in the deep forest. The concept is to give it something willingly, so that it does not simply take everything it desires, but the price they describe, the price is almost too high to contemplate. My wife begs me to abandon this place, to take our children and flee to her family in the east. But where would we go? The entity seems tied to our bloodline now, as much as to the land itself. August 10th, 1898. The symbols have begun appearing everywhere, carved into the stones of our foundation walls, burned into the bark of trees, even scratched into the wooden beams inside the house. They pulse with a faint phosphorescent light in the darkness, growing brighter as the moon wanes. I feel its presence constantly now, those invisible eyes watching my every movement. It knows my daily routines, my fears, my weaknesses. It is studying me, learning me, preparing for something. Silas Blackwood's final entry was dated August 15th, 1898. It contained only one chilling line. It knows my name now, whispers it in the darkness. The time has come. I closed the journal with shaking hands. This wasn't just a pattern of unusual crimes. This was generations of terror, a legacy of horror, tied to something ancient and malevolent that had been feeding on the Blackwood family for over 2 centuries. The missing persons reports from the police files now seemed like modern footnotes to a very old and very dark story. But there was something else I needed to investigate, something personal that had been nagging at me since I first received this assignment. My great-aunt Clara, she had been my grandmother's younger sister, a free-spirited artist who loved nature and hiking. She had come out to Washington State in the summer of 1965 to visit my grandmother, who had married and moved west after the war. According to family stories, Clara and my grandmother had planned a trip to see the old-growth forests of the Olympic Peninsula. They had stayed in a small town not far from here. Then Clara had decided to explore on her own, as was her nature. She had gone into the woods for what was supposed to be a day hike. She never came back. The official story was that she had gotten lost, or fallen from a cliff, or perhaps encountered a wild animal. Search parties had found nothing. No trace of her was ever discovered. My grandmother had grieved for years, and my father, Clara's nephew, had never even known her. But he had kept one thing that had belonged to her, a small silver locket that he had given to me years ago for luck. I carried it in my pocket always. Going through Thomas Blackwood's personal belongings, which had been collected and stored in a box in the study, I found an old photo album, the kind with sticky pages and clear plastic covers, filled with faded color photographs from the 1960s and 70s, family picnics, Christmas gatherings, birthday parties, the normal detritus of a normal life. Then I saw a photograph that made my heart stop, a group shot taken outside the manor, showing several people I didn't recognize standing on the front steps, and there, standing next to a young man with dark hair and a confident smile, was a face I knew from old family photos. Young, shy, beautiful. It was my great-aunt Clara. She was standing very close to the young man, their body language suggesting intimacy, familiarity. They looked like a couple. Around Clara's neck was a silver chain, and hanging from it was a locket identical to the one in my pocket. I flipped the photograph over. In faded blue ink, someone had written, Robert and Clara, summer 1965. Robert Blackwood, the man who had disappeared 50 years ago. The same year, Clara had vanished. My great-aunt hadn't simply gotten lost on a hiking trip. She had been here at Blackwood Manor with Robert Blackwood, and they had both disappeared at the same time, just as the journals described, just as the pattern dictated. I pulled the locket from my pocket and held it up to the light. It felt heavier than I remembered and colder. What I had always assumed was a family heirloom was actually something else entirely, a connection to this place, to the Blackwood family, to the curse that had been claiming lives for centuries. The locket felt like a target now, a beacon that marked me as connected to this place and its dark history. My involvement wasn't just professional, it was personal, written in blood and family ties that stretched back 50 years. I wasn't just investigating the Blackwood disappearances, I was part of them. Night fell quickly in the deep woods. The darkness was absolute, pressing against the windows like a living thing. I had brought minimal supplies, a flashlight, extra batteries, some energy bars, my digital recorder, and a sleeping bag. I chose a small bedroom on the second floor, reasoning that it would be safer than staying on the ground floor with its oppressive atmosphere and that fresh blood on the stone. The room was sparsely furnished, a single bed with a bare mattress, a small dresser, and a chair by the window. I locked the door, though I knew it was a futile gesture. The lock was old and probably wouldn't hold against a determined human intruder, much less whatever I was beginning to suspect actually threatened this place. I tried to sleep, but the house was far from quiet. Every few minutes, I would hear creaking sounds, footsteps on the stairs, doors opening and closing, whispers of conversation just too faint to understand. I told myself it was just the normal sounds of an old house settling, but my trained mind knew better. These weren't random noises, they had pattern and purpose. Then, the whispers started, not from elsewhere in the house, but right there in the room with me. They began at just the edge of hearing, like a swarm of insects buzzing in the walls. Gradually, they grew louder and more distinct. I couldn't make out actual words. The language seemed foreign, ancient, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, hunger, malevolent purpose. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart hammering against my ribs. I shone my flashlight around the room, but the beam revealed nothing but dust and shadows. The whispers continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The temperature in the room began to drop rapidly. Within minutes, I could see my breath misting in the beam of my flashlight. The cold wasn't coming from outside. It was localized, concentrated in one corner of the room. I turned my light toward that corner and felt my blood freeze. The cold was so intense, it was like standing next to an industrial freezer. But there was something else. The air itself seemed to shimmer and distort, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but cold and wrong. And within that distortion, something was taking shape. A shadow began to form in the corner, not a normal shadow cast by an object blocking light, but something that seemed to exist independently of any light source. It was darker than the surrounding darkness, a void that hurt to look at directly. It writhed and pulsed like a living thing, and as I watched in growing terror, it began to lean toward me. The whispers reached a crescendo, becoming almost understandable. Words in that alien language pressed against my consciousness, trying to force their way into my mind. I felt them like ice-cold fingers probing the inside of my skull, seeking purchase, seeking control. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come. My throat felt paralyzed, my lungs unable to draw breath. The shadow thing expanded, reaching across the room toward me with tendrils of absolute darkness. I could feel its attention like a physical weight, pressing down on me, studying me, evaluating me. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The cold receded, the whispers faded back to barely audible murmurs, and I was left alone in the dark room, shaking uncontrollably. Sweat slicked my forehead, despite the lingering chill in the air. This wasn't stress-induced hallucination. This wasn't a trick of light and shadow brought on by isolation and suggestion. Something real and malevolent shared this house with me, and it was aware of my presence. More than that, it was interested in me. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside, sounded like a threat. My rational mind, my most trusted tool throughout my career, felt compromised and unreliable. The whispers had left something behind, a residue of alien thought that made it difficult to think clearly. I spent the next day researching more intensively, diving deeper into the historical documents and journals. There was a recurring theme throughout the centuries of Blackwood family records. The land itself was described as aware, intelligent, and hungry. The family seemed to have developed a complex and terrible relationship with whatever dwelt in the forest, part worship, part negotiation, part desperate attempt at appeasement. I found a bound manuscript, hidden behind other books on one of the higher shelves. It was titled An Account of the Unseen Hand upon Blackwood Land, and had been written by a local historian in the 1930s. He had collected legends and first-hand accounts from long-time residents of the area, creating a chilling picture of generational horror. According to his research, the entity that haunted Blackwood Land was not a Native American spirit or any other conventional supernatural being. It was something far older, something that had existed in the deep forest since before human memory. The first Blackwood settlers had encountered it when they began clearing land for their homestead, and rather than flee as sensible people might have done, they had attempted to negotiate with it. The bargain struck between Jeremiah Blackwood and the forest presence has never been fully documented, the historian wrote, but the evidence suggests a terrible trade, prosperity and protection for the family, in exchange for periodic sacrifice. The land would provide rich soil, abundant game, protection from natural disasters, but it would also take, not randomly, but according to a pattern that seems tied to both celestial events and the emotional bonds within the family itself. The historian described how the entity fed, not just on life, but on the grief and loss experienced by those left behind. It chose its victims carefully, always selecting someone whose disappearance would cause maximum emotional devastation to the surviving family members. In this way, it fed both on the physical essence of its prey and on the spiritual anguish of the living. I cross-referenced the disappearance dates from the police files with astronomical charts I found in the library. The historian was right. Almost every vanishing had occurred within days of specific lunar phases, meteor showers, or other celestial events visible from this location. The pattern held across centuries: Thomas Blackwood in 2015 during a minor meteor shower, Sarah in 1998 during a significant lunar eclipse, Robert and Clara in 1965 during a major meteor event. This wasn't random predation. It was systematic, ritualistic, tied to something cosmic and ancient that I was only beginning to comprehend. Among the papers in the study, I found hand-drawn maps of the property dating back to the original settlement. They showed trails, creeks, notable landmarks, and one spot deep in the forest marked with a small X and labeled simply The Stones. References in several journals mentioned this location as the heart of the wood and the place where the old ways are observed. The historian's account included a fragmentary description of rituals performed at this site during certain celestial alignments. The details were vague, either because witnesses had been reluctant to speak clearly about what they had seen, or because the experiences had been so traumatic that coherent description was impossible. But the general outline was clear. Someone connected to the Blackwood family would be brought to the stone circle, and whatever dwelled there would claim them as tribute. As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly oppressive. The air felt thick and electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Though the sky outside remained clear, My satellite phone, which had been working intermittently, finally died completely. The battery showed full charge, but the device simply wouldn't power on. Something was actively interfering with electronic signals. I heard sounds from elsewhere in the house. Footsteps on the stairs, doors opening and closing, the scraping of furniture being moved. When I investigated, I found nothing disturbed, but I did discover something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the wooden wall near the front door was a symbol identical to those I had seen in the old journals. The carving was fresh, with splinters of wood still scattered on the floor beneath it. I tried to leave. The front door, which I had left slightly ajar when I first entered, was now firmly closed. When I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. I pushed against it with all my strength, but it felt like pushing against solid stone. The windows were similarly sealed, their latches somehow frozen in place. I was trapped in Blackwood Manor, with whatever was making those sounds, carving those symbols, and filling the air with whispers and unnatural cold. Using the old map as a guide, I found my way to the cellar through a door off the kitchen. The stone walls were slick with moisture, and the air was even colder than upstairs. I located the broken grate mentioned in one of Silas Blackwood's journal entries, a forgotten entrance that led up to ground level outside the main house structure. With a rusted crowbar I found in the cellar, I managed to pry the grate open enough to squeeze through. The metal shrieked in protest, and I felt the house itself resisting my escape, but eventually I broke free into the overgrown bushes behind the manor. Following the creek northwest, as indicated on the map, I made my way through increasingly dense forest. The trees seemed to press closer with each step, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even midday felt like twilight. The temperature continued to drop, and that persistent sweet smell grew stronger, mixed now with something metallic and ancient. A low humming sound began to emanate from the ground beneath my feet, growing stronger as I walked deeper into the woods. It was like the vibration of massive machinery, but organic somehow, as if the earth itself was breathing. Then I saw them, 4 standing stones arranged in a rough circle, each about 8 feet tall, and covered in centuries of moss and lichen. They were clearly ancient, predating any human settlement in the area. In the center of the circle, the ground was bare and darker than the surrounding forest floor. Embedded in the earth was a large, smooth stone, similar to the one I had found in the manor's foyer, but much larger, about the size of a small table. The surface of the central stone was stained with what could only be dried blood. Layer upon layer of it built up over centuries, and there, still glistening wetly in the dim light, was a fresh stain. Someone had been here recently. Thomas Blackwood, or whatever had taken him. As I stepped into the circle of stones, the temperature plummeted to an almost unbearable level. The humming intensified until I could feel it in my bones, and the whispers I had heard in the house returned with overwhelming force. They were no longer just at the edge of hearing. They were inside my head, pressing against my consciousness like cold fingers. Above the central stone, the air began to distort and shimmer. Something was forming there, something that existed in the spaces between visible light and shadow. It was not a creature in any sense I could understand. It had no fixed form, no recognizable anatomy. It was presence itself, malevolence given substance, an entity of pure hunger that had been feeding on this land and its people for countless generations. The whispers became a roar of alien voices, and within that cacophony, I heard something that stopped my heart. "Eleanor, run." The voice was faint and distorted, but unmistakably familiar. It was Clara's voice, my great-aunt's voice, somehow preserved within the entity that had claimed her 50 years ago. The shadow thing above the stone pulsed and writhed, reaching toward me with tendrils of absolute darkness. I felt crushing pressure, like being pulled underwater, and a cold beyond anything I had ever experienced. It was trying to engulf me, to absorb me into itself, just as it had absorbed Clara and Robert and countless others over the centuries. I stumbled backward and fell, my head striking the ground hard enough to blur my vision. The entity loomed over me, filling my sight with writhing darkness. In that moment of terror, my hand found the locket in my pocket. It felt warm now, pulsing with some kind of energy that seemed to repel the approaching darkness. I remembered something from Silas Blackwood's journal, his desperate attempts to find a way to appease the entity, to give it something so it doesn't take everything. The locket was my connection to this place, to the Blackwood family, through Clara's relationship with Robert. It was what had marked me as a target, but perhaps it could also be my salvation. With the shadow entity pressing down on me, trying to crush my will and absorb my essence, I made a desperate choice. I couldn't remove the locket's chain, but I could sever my connection to it in another way. I brought the locket down hard on the sharp edge of the central stone. Pain exploded through my hand as flesh split and bone cracked. The locket clattered onto the stone surface, landing in the fresh stain that had been left there by whoever had come before me. My hot blood seemed to repel the entity, or perhaps satisfy some requirement of the ancient pact that governed this place. The shadow thing recoiled with a soundless shriek that tore through my mind. The pressure around me lessened, and the crushing cold receded slightly. I had severed my physical connection to the locket, to the bloodline it represented, with my own sacrifice. It was a twisted mirror of the original pact, a price paid in pain and loss. But I knew I hadn't defeated the entity. I had only bought myself time. The whispers returned, furious now. Fool, you only delay the inevitable. The debt remains. The hunger is eternal. I stumbled out of the stone circle and ran blindly through the forest, not stopping until I reached the rusted gate where my SUV waited. I drove away from Blackwood Manor as fast as the narrow roads would allow, not looking back. I'm telling this story now from the safety of civilization, but I know that safety is temporary. The entity of Blackwood Manor isn't gone, it's simply waiting. My sacrifice bought me escape, but it didn't break the cycle or end the hunger. The manor still stands, silent and gaunt against the forest backdrop. The curse endures. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment, the air grows cold for just a moment, and I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. The entity marked me during our encounter, and I suspect it's not finished with me yet. The locket sits on my bedside table. I retrieved it from the hospital where they treated my injuries. I can't bring myself to wear it again, but I can't throw it away either. It's the only proof I have that any of this really happened. My hand healed, but it left scars that serve as a constant reminder of what I experienced. I've returned to my work as a forensic psychologist, but everything is different now. My mind, once a sterile and controlled environment, is open to things I cannot explain or categorize. The whispers left something behind, a residue of alien thought that makes it difficult to dismiss the impossible. The true crime at Blackwood Manor isn't just the disappearances, it's the ancient pact that allows them to continue, the generational horror that feeds on human suffering and connection. It's a crime without a perpetrator you can arrest, or a victim you can properly mourn. It's a wound in reality itself, a place where something older and hungrier than human understanding has established a foothold in our world. Thomas Blackwood's disappearance remains officially unsolved, filed away with the others in a pattern that stretches back centuries. The local authorities have quietly cordoned off the area, though they'll never admit why. No one goes to Blackwood Manor anymore. Not the police, not curiosity seekers, not anyone who values their life and sanity. But the hunger is patient. It has waited for centuries, and it can wait centuries more. Somewhere in the deep forest, in the circle of ancient stones, something watches and waits for the next alignment, the next connection, the next opportunity to feed. The Blackwood line may be ended, but the entity's appetite extends beyond blood relations to anyone touched by the family's dark legacy. I carry that legacy now, marked by my encounter with something that should not exist. This story is my confession and my warning. Stay away from Blackwood Manor. Stay away from the deep woods of the Olympic Peninsula, and pray that the hunger in the forest never learns your name. The whispers never truly stop. They're always there, just at the edge of hearing, reminding me that some debts can never be fully paid, and some hungers can never be truly satisfied. Blackwood Manor stands empty now, but it's not abandoned. It's waiting, as it has waiting for centuries, for the next alignment, the next connection, the next opportunity to feed. My escape from the woods was a blur of adrenaline and agony. The pain in my hand was blinding, a constant throbbing counterpoint to the terror that clawed at my mind. I somehow managed to start the SUV, my injured hand fumbling with the key, and drove erratically down the muddy track, the forest pressing in on either side like hungry teeth. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, didn't dare slow down. I drove for what felt like hours, the sun already setting by the time I hit a paved road and saw the first signs of civilization, a faded billboard advertising a diner miles back. My phone still refused to work, the battery displaying full power but the screen resolutely dark. I pulled over to the side of the road, my body shaking uncontrollably, the chill from the stone circle still clinging to me despite the rising evening temperature. I found a small rural hospital late that night. My story about how I'd injured my hand was deliberately vague, a fall in the woods, a sharp rock. I didn't mention the manor, the stones, or the shadow thing. The nurses and doctors were kind but puzzled by the severity of the injury for such a simple explanation. My hand was badly cut and bruised, requiring stitches and a splint. The doctor mentioned something about unusually clean breaks in the small bones, inconsistent with a simple fall onto a rock, but he dismissed it as a minor anomaly. He didn't see the cold, didn't feel the lingering wrongness that had soaked into my clothes, my skin, my very soul. They asked about my purpose in the area. I showed them my official identification and mentioned my government assignment, careful to stick to the cover story, assessing the Blackwood property for potential environmental hazards after Thomas Blackwood's disappearance. They nodded, accepting my explanation, though their eyes held a flicker of that familiar local apprehension when the name Blackwood Manor was mentioned. It was clear the place had a reputation, a history of strangeness that predated my arrival by generations. The locket had been retrieved from my pocket by the medical staff when they admitted me. I insisted on keeping it close, a small, tarnished silver object that felt impossibly heavy in my bandaged hand. It was proof, tangible and undeniable, that I hadn't imagined the stone circle, the blood, the terrible choice I'd made. It was also a constant chilling reminder of my connection to the horror, my great-aunt's tragic fate, and the ancient entity that had claimed her. Recovery was difficult. The physical pain was manageable, but the psychological trauma was profound. My nights were haunted by dreams of the forest, the whispering voices, and the formless shadow. During the day, I struggled to reconcile my experiences with my training. For years, I had analyzed fractured minds, seeking rational explanations for irrational behavior. Now my own mind felt fractured, confronted with a reality that defied logic, science, and everything I thought I knew about the world. My superiors were understanding, to a point. A difficult assignment, they called it. Stress, isolation, perhaps a minor psychological reaction to the atmospheric pressure of the old house and the tragic history of the disappearances. They listened patiently to my report, which was heavily edited to remove any mention of ancient pacts, whispering entities, or objects that pulsed with malevolent energy. I presented the evidence I had gathered on the disappearances, the pattern similarities, the historical documents I'd photographed or transcribed, the unsettling local legends. I focused on the environmental hazard angle, suggesting potential geological anomalies or undetected gases that might explain the vanishings and the localized cold spots. They accepted the report, filed it away, and quietly closed the investigation, citing lack of credible evidence for foul play or environmental hazard. Blackwood Manor was deemed an unstable property, not a crime scene. I tried to return to my work, but the detachment I'd cultivated over a decade of dealing with the darkest aspects of human behavior was gone. I saw patterns where there were none, heard whispers in the silence of my office, and felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck whenever I was alone after dark. The faces of my patients, once simply case studies, seemed to hold hidden depths of suffering that I now understood on a visceral level. I knew, with chilling certainty, that some minds were not just broken by trauma or illness, but perhaps touched by things that existed outside the realm of human comprehension, things that could break you in ways no therapy could fix. I resigned from my position a few months later. I couldn't continue to function in that world, pretending that the universe was a neat, predictable place governed by rules I understood. My experience at Blackwood Manor had fundamentally altered my perception of reality. The veil between our world and something ancient and hungry had been lifted, and I couldn't unsee what I had witnessed. My obsession with Blackwood Manor didn't end after I left. It deepened, consuming my life. I used my savings and the severance pay to fund my own research. I scoured online archives, rare book dealers, and academic databases. I sought out experts, folklorists, historians, even a few discreet parapsychologists who operated on the fringes of mainstream science. I spent countless hours poring over texts that most people would dismiss as myth or fantasy. I delved deeper into the history of the Blackwood family and the land itself. The original grant records from the colonial era showed the property lines were drawn in a peculiar, irregular shape, seemingly avoiding certain areas deep within the woods. Old surveyor's notes mentioned anomalies in magnetic readings near the location of the stone circle, an unexplained phenomena that made survey crews reluctant to work in that section of the forest. I read accounts of indigenous peoples in the region, seeking confirmation of the warning Silas Blackwood had mentioned. It was difficult. Centuries of displacement and cultural loss meant that much traditional knowledge had been lost or was fiercely guarded. But I found fragments, whispers of a concept known in some tribal traditions as the Old Ones, not spirits of the dead, but entities coexisting with the natural world, tied to specific geographical locations, neither inherently good nor evil, but possessed of immense power and a different set of motivations and needs than humans. Some accounts described a delicate balance that needed to be maintained, a reciprocal relationship, where respect and sometimes offerings were required to prevent these entities from disrupting the human world. The Blackwood family, with their attempts to bargain and appease, seemed to have stumbled upon a perversion of this ancient concept, turning a potential coexistence into a system of forced tribute. The locket became a focal point of my research. It wasn't made of ordinary silver. I had it discreetly analyzed. The metal contained trace elements that were unusual, not typically found in alloys of that period. More intriguingly, the locket seemed to absorb and retain energy. When I was close to it, I sometimes felt that lingering cold, that faint buzzing sensation that reminded me of the stones. I theorized it wasn't just a piece of jewelry given by Robert to Clara. It might have been something used in the rituals Silas Blackwood mentioned, a token or a focus object involved in the pact itself. My blood shed onto the stone, and the locket had somehow interacted with this energy, temporarily disrupting the entity's attempt to claim me. It wasn't a weapon, but a key, one that could link or sever a connection to the entity and the land. I learned more about the celestial alignments the historian had mentioned. They weren't random astronomical events. They were specific, often rare occurrences. Meteor showers where specific constellations were visible, lunar eclipses coinciding with planetary conjunctions, moments when the energy of the cosmos, somehow amplified by the unique properties of the land, was at its peak. These were the times when the veil was thinnest, when the entity's hunger was most potent, and when the pact demanded payment. The hunger, I came to believe, wasn't simply for physical life, but for something more abstract: connection, emotion, essence. When someone disappeared, the entity didn't just consume their body, it absorbed their existence, their memories, their ties to the living world. This explained the lack of physical trace, the feeling of total erasure. It fed on the grief and fear of those left behind, drawing energy from the psychic residue of loss. Clara's voice, echoing in the stone circle, was not a ghost but a fragment of her essence, trapped and distorted within the entity, a chilling testament to its consumption. The silence around Blackwood Manor in the local community was telling. No one spoke of it openly. It was a place to be avoided, a forbidden zone steeped in unspoken dread. The official story of property instability and closed investigation didn't deter the truly curious or the foolhardy. I tracked online forums and local news reports. There were whispers, rumors of people who had trespassed on the property and returned, changed. Some spoke of vivid nightmares, inexplicable cold spots in their homes, objects moving on their own. Others simply became withdrawn, haunted, their eyes holding a look of distant terror. A few had reportedly vanished themselves after spending time near the manor, their disappearances mirroring the old Blackwood pattern, though the local police dismissed them as unrelated runaways or accidents. The entity's attention wasn't limited to the Blackwood bloodline anymore. It extended to anyone who drew too close, anyone who became entangled with the land or its history. My encounter, my sacrifice, had made me a part of that history, a thread in the ancient tapestry of horror woven by the Blackwood family's misguided pact. I considered going back. The thought was both terrifying and compelling. My rational mind screamed against it, but a part of me, the part that had been touched by the whispers and the cold, felt a strange pull towards the manor, towards the stone circle. I fantasized about finding a way to break the pact, to sever the entity's connection to the land, to release the trapped essences like Clara's. But my research offered no such hope. The pact was ancient, woven into the fabric of the land itself. Breaking it seemed impossible, or perhaps would unleash something even worse. Instead, I decided to document, to record my story, to gather all my research, to leave behind a record of what happened, a warning for anyone who might stumble upon this dark corner of the world. This video is part of that effort. My confession is not just about the past, it's about the present danger, the invisible threat that still lurks in the shadows of Blackwood Manor, patient and hungry. The scars on my hand are a constant physical reminder, but the deeper scars are etched onto my mind. I live with the knowledge that the world is not what it seems, that ancient, unfathomable forces exist just beyond our perception, and that sometimes the darkest corners are not within the human mind, but in the very ground beneath our feet. The whispers are still there. They are fainter now, sometimes barely audible, but they never truly cease. They are a constant hum beneath the surface of my thoughts, a chilling reminder that I am marked, that the entity knows my name, and that the debt I incurred, the brief reprieve I bought with my blood, is not permanent. It is waiting for the right moment, the right alignment, to collect what it is owed. I have changed my name, moved several times, taken precautions that would seem paranoid to anyone who hasn't experienced what I have, but I know it's largely futile. The entity is tied to the land, but its reach extends through the connections made there. I am a connection. Clara's locket is a connection. The experience itself is a connection. You cannot outrun something that exists partly outside of physical space and time. I see the world differently now. Forests are no longer just collections of trees. They feel ancient, watchful, holding secrets that predate humanity. The silence of the wilderness is not empty. It is filled with the potential for things unseen, things that lurk just beyond the edge of hearing. History is not just dates and events. It is layers of forgotten stories, some too dark, too impossible to be allowed into the official narrative. I often think about the Blackwood family, the generations trapped by this terrible pact. Were they victims or complicit participants? Did they truly believe they were protecting themselves and their prosperity? Or did the entity's influence corrupt them, twisting their perceptions until sacrifice seemed like a necessary act? Silas's journal entries paint a picture of desperation and fear, of a man trying to navigate an impossible situation with limited, terrifying knowledge. Perhaps they were as much prisoners of the pact as those it claimed. The most chilling realization is the subtle, insidious way the entity operates. It doesn't rely on force or visible violence. It uses connection, emotion, timing. It exploits vulnerabilities, both of the land and of the human heart. It's a predator that feeds on fear, grief, and the threads that tie people together. It's a parasite on reality itself, thriving in the spaces between sanity and madness, life and disappearance. This story is finished for now, but my experience is not. The encounter at Blackwood Manor was not an isolated incident. It was the beginning of something that has no clear end. I live with the constant awareness of the entity's presence, a shadow at the edge of my life. I monitor the news from the Olympic Peninsula, looking for any hint, any rumor that the pattern is continuing. Sometimes I see something, a brief mention of an unexplained disappearance near the woods, a local news story about strange occurrences that are quickly dismissed. I know what it means. The hunger is still there. I continue my research, not with the hope of finding a solution, but with the desperate need to understand. Perhaps understanding, even a fragmented, terrifying understanding, is the only defense I have. The locket sits beside me as I work, sometimes cold, sometimes faintly vibrating, a tangible link to the impossible. This is my confession. This is my warning. If you hear whispers in the silence, if the air around you suddenly turns cold for no reason, if you feel unseen eyes watching you from the shadows, remember Blackwood Manor, remember the Blackwood family, remember Clara Vance, and pray that you are not the next connection, the next thread the ancient hunger seeks to unravel. Thank you for listening. I don't know if sharing this story helps, or if it simply draws more attention, but I have to tell it. It's the only way I can process the truth I found buried in the dust and decay of that desolate house. It's the only way I can try to make sense of the impossible. I don't know if there will be future videos. I don't know what the future holds. All I know is that Blackwood Manor stands empty, waiting, and I am waiting too. Waiting for the whispers to grow louder, waiting for the cold to settle in, waiting for the inevitable moment when the ancient debt is finally called due and the hunger in the forest comes for me. Stay safe. Be aware. Not all disappearances are accidents. Some are collected. And once something ancient and hungry has marked you, it rarely forgets. The story of Blackwood Manor isn't over. It's just paused, and the pause is always temporary.